When I first played Lost Mine of Phandelver, as a player, I asked my DM at the end of the adventure, who was that necromancer? What was up with that ghost lady? And what would have happened if we'd found that spell book? And what followed was one of the most profoundly disappointing experiences I've ever had playing Dungeons & Dragons. My DM just kind of shrugged and said, nothing. And I said, what do you mean nothing? What does it say in the module? And he said, nothing. They're all just hooks for you guys to bite onto. And then I'm supposed to, make something up. I felt like I had peeked behind the curtain and seen, not the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, but rather a dowdy old man flailing about. No, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. But here's the thing. My DM wasn't lying. He was just telling the wrong half of the truth. When I asked him, what would have happened when we found that spell book? He should have looked me dead in the eye and said, something amazing, I guess. Because that is also true. The side quests presented in this book are just hooks. But with your help, they can become so much more. So let's talk about side quests. What they are, why they are, and how you can make each of them shine. So what is a side quest in Dungeons & Dragons? Analogous to a subplot or a B-plot in movies, television, or books, a side quest is any optional task that doesn't directly contribute to completing the main quest. But instead of task, let's use the language of storytelling and say conflict. Chasing after the street rats who stole your coin purse? That's a subplot, even if it only takes 10 minutes. Getting vengeance on the six-fingered man who killed your father? That's also a subplot, even if it takes 37 sessions of D&D. Pretty simple, right? Let's move on to a more difficult question. Why do stories have subplots? My old DM said, they're just hooks for the players to bite onto. And it's true. For the players, biting hooks is just plain fun. But more importantly, it gives them agency, both as storytellers and as characters. They get to choose which hooks they bite. It also gives cover for the main plot, in the sense that the players never know which hooks or threads are connected to what the story is, quote-unquote, actually about. Those street rats that stole your coin purse? Maybe one of them is the runaway son of the big bad evil guy. Maybe he knows a secret passage in and out of the castle. There's another reason why subplots are so useful. Because they generate shelved ideas. In improv, a shelved idea is something that has been introduced but wasn't explored right away, at least not fully. When you hear an audience at an improv show gasp or applaud or laugh uncontrollably, it's often because a little throwaway line from the very beginning has come back at the end in a big way. When a shelved idea is so striking and so memorable that it absolutely must be used or else the audience will be disappointed, we call that a Chekhov's gun. If, in the first act, there is a rifle hanging on the wall, said Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, in the second or third act, it absolutely must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it shouldn't be hanging there.
I got the results of the test back. I definitely have breast cancer.
In screenwriting, we would call this foreshadowing. But it's important to remember, you are not a writer. You are first and foremost an improviser. Of course, you can intentionally foreshadow stuff, and you should, but many of your punchiest shelved ideas will come from improvisation. Do not neglect them. On the subject of theme, screenwriter Robert McKee offers a couple good reasons to use subplots. First, to contradict the theme of the story, and thus add irony or nuance. This is often done by use of a character foil, that is, a character similar to the protagonist except for the presence or absence of a major flaw or virtue. An example of a non-antagonistic character foil is the aptly named Anthony Hope in the story of Sweeney Todd. His subplot is, in many ways, a mirror of the main plot, but with a very different ending. And without this subplot, the audience might be inclined to overextend the theme of the movie. Secondly, McKee asserts that subplots can be used to resonate the theme and enrich the film with variations on a theme. He gives the example of A Midsummer Night's Dream. All the many love stories end happily, but some sweetly, some farcically, and some sublimely. Now, you may have noticed that the middle part of a movie, or especially the middle episodes of a TV show, can be pretty dry. This is often called second act drag, where time seems to move in slow motion between the climax of the first act and the climax of the second act. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch the last video I made about the 3-act structure in Lost Mine of Phandelver. For some stories, especially pulse-pounding thrillers, the solution to second act drag may seem rather simple. Just add more acts. Because more acts equals more climaxes equals more fun, right? But screenwriter Robert McKee, once again, explains why that might not always be such a great idea. The multiplication of acts reduces the impact of climaxes and results in repetitiousness. Even if the writer feels he's up to creating a major reversal every 15 minutes, turning act climaxes on scenes of life and death, life and death, life and death 7 or 8 times over, boredom sets in. Before too long, the audience is yawning. That's not a major turn. That's his day. Every 15 minutes somebody tries to kill the guy. So instead, we use subplots. And if subplots exist to give the audience a break from the main plot, as a rule of thumb, we should avoid introducing them until after the heroes have understood and accepted the main plot. This is especially true because D&D is an unscripted medium. It's easy for the players to get plots confused. There is, however, an exception to this rule: the setup subplot. Again, returning to Robert McKee, for the last time, I promise. He writes, a late arriving central plot, for example, Rocky, Chinatown, Casablanca, leaves a story vacuum that must be filled by subplots to engage the audience's interest and acquaint it with the protagonist and his world in order to evoke a full reaction to its inciting incident. However, he also warns, a setup subplot is particularly dangerous in that it may mislead the audience as to genre. The opening love story of Rocky, for example, was carefully handled so that we knew we were headed for the sports genre. How does this relate to D&D? Well, many people online say they want to open Lost Mine of Phandelver with a one-shot in Neverwinter in order to meet Gundren or get the team together. That can work, but you've got to be very careful to avoid genre whiplash. The first session does more than any other session to establish your players' expectations. If there are, vampires, they're going to expect the rest of the adventure to also be about vampires. Which brings us to my second point. Lost Mine of Phandelver is a short adventure, like 8 to 10 sessions short. It, by itself, can be an excellent setup to a larger adventure. For example, Storm King's Thunder, or even Curse of Strahd. But if you're gonna do that, remember to sprinkle in a few genre clues for your players to pick up on. Maybe they have a friendly encounter with the frost giant Harshnag along the Tribor Trail. Maybe those doppelgangers are vampire thralls instead. Let's move on to the specific subplots of the original Lost Mine of Phandelver. They all come in Chapter 3, and they are, namely, visiting Agatha in Coneybury, exploring the ruins of Thundertree, dealing with the orcs at Wyvern Tor, and investigating Old Owl Well. Let's look at each of these briefly and see what shelved ideas they might generate, and how they might be used to set up a later adventure. At the Shrine of Luck in Phandalin, Sister Garail asks our heroes to visit a banshee named Agatha in the ruined town of Coneybury. They are to ask her specifically about the location of the Book of Bowgentle. The Book of Bowgentle is a prime example of a shelved idea. It can be anything you need it to be. Maybe it's instructions on operating the Forge of Spells. Maybe it's the journal of someone who explored the ruins of Phandelver, like, watch out for those poisonous mushrooms. If you're running Phandelver and below, the Book of Bowgentle could be a guide to defeating mind flayers, or extracting illithid tadpoles. If you're planning on running Storm King's Thunder, it could be a guide to Asturian runes. In our playthrough of Lost Mine of Phandelver, which I ran as a prequel to Curse of Strahd, and which you can check out over on Patreon, the Book of Bowgentle was a guide to treating someone who'd been bitten by a vampire. As for the location, it could easily be in the keep at Thundertree, at Old Owl Well, or somewhere in Wave Echo Cave. Let me know in the comments below how the Book of Bowgentle turned out in your playthrough. At Alderleaf Farm in Phandalin, Colleen suggested our heroes visit the druid Rydoth in Thundertree, and Myrna, one of the Red Brand's captives, told them about a valuable heirloom, an emerald necklace she'd hidden there. Hypothetically, Myrna's necklace can do whatever you want it to. Consider what problems your heroes are facing and what kind of magic item might help them. Flip through the DMG and reflavor whichever magic item seems suitable. The dragon cultists in Thundertree are an odd shelved idea. Unless you're running Tyranny of Dragons after, consider reflavoring these guys to something more fitting. There is one huge shelved idea here that we just can't overlook, however. For many people, Venom Fang feels like a Chekhov's gun. There's no way this dragon is just gonna fly away never to be seen again, right? If, at the climax of the story, the Black Spider goes down a little too easy, it can be a great, oh crap moment to have Venom Fang then emerge from the darkness. However, I see a lot of DMs online proposing a three-way fight between these forces, and I just don't think it's a great idea. You really want to avoid making the players feel like they're just watching the DM play with their action figures. Never forget who the protagonists are. Did Venom Fang come back to haunt the players in your playthrough? Let me know in the comments below. At Eatermath Orchard in Phandalin, Daran asks our heroes to investigate the undead presence at Old Owl Well. Once there, they encounter Hamun Kost, a red wizard of Thay. He's interested in finding out who built the tower at Old Owl Well. The answer in the original is Arthendal, which has been changed to Dressina in the new release. Notice that they changed the wizard's stat block as well. You should be noticing a few possible shelved ideas here. First, a red wizard of Thay could be an ambitious and nosy character that returns later on. How might he react to the rediscovery of the Forge of Spells? Why is the builder of the tower important? Perhaps it was someone connected to Phandelver. Perhaps it was the same someone who summoned the Spectator to guard the Forge of Spells. But I admit, this one is a bit of a sticky wicket. Let me know in the comments below why you think the builder's name might prove significant. A final point about Old Owl Well is that there are quite a few undead creatures in Lost Mine of Phandelver, but only one necromancer. Maybe someone has been exploring more than just Old Owl Well. Maybe someone is trying to equip an undead army with green flame blades. This can also work as a setup plot for an undead/Thay-based sequel. At the Townmaster's Hall in Phandelver, Harbin asks our heroes to take care of some orc trouble out at Wyvern Tor. In the original, this is the most rudimentary side quest. But you'll notice in Phandelver and below, they've added a few things. A map, for one thing, but also, on the walls of the cave, a painting depicting a lanky goblin with a crystal jutting from its skull. This is foreshadowing for the psionic goblins in the sequel, the Shattered Obelisk. And so this is a good time to remind you that, if you plan on running that adventure, you should probably sprinkle in some genre hints in other places as well, that this campaign is going to be increasingly eldritch and alien. Unless it's intentional, we want to avoid giving our players genre whiplash. To recap, there are a number of reasons why an adventure includes side quests. To give hooks for the players to bite onto, thus giving them choice and agency. To generate shelved ideas that can be used later on. And remember that some shelved ideas are so significant that they must be used later on. That's called a Chekhov's gun. To counterbalance or resonate with the theme. To avoid second act drag. And remember, as a rule of thumb, don't introduce subplots until the heroes have understood and accepted the main plot. Unless, of course, it's a setup subplot. And remember, Phandelver itself could serve as a setup subplot for a larger campaign. When you're prepping, and when you're running the side quests of Lost Mine of Phandelver, that is, Agatha, Thundertree, Old Owl Well, and Wyvern Tor, consider how they can generate shelved ideas, and how they can serve as a setup for later plot points. So that's it for this video. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Check us out over on Patreon if you want to watch our full playthrough of the Lost Mine of Phandelver adventure. Remember that I believe in you, and the best thing you can do is fail and try again. I'll see you next time.